Welcome back to the Doom of Valyria. In this episode, we travel deeper into the world of ancient Valyria as we explore the mysterious 14 Flames, the volcanoes that shaped the rise of the Valyrian freehold. We'll uncover what is known about their origins, meet the powerful Dragonlord families beyond the Targaryens, and explore the brutal Rhoynar Wars that changed the history of Essos forever. So, let's go back to the age of dragons, fire, and conquest, and uncover the story behind the power that once ruled the world. At the heart of the Valyrian Peninsula stood a massive chain of volcanoes known as the 14 Flames. These were not ordinary mountains. They were living mountains filled with fire, molten rock, underground heat, and deep mines. The 14 Flames stretched across the Valyrian Peninsula and became the foundation of the civilization that would eventually dominate much of Essos. But there is one important mystery here. George R. Martin has never explained exactly how the 14 Flames were formed. The books tell us what they were, but not their complete geological origin. We know they were an enormous volcanic chain, and we know that Valyrian civilization grew around them. Later, when the Doom came, the 14 Flames erupted in a catastrophe so powerful that the entire Valyrian Peninsula was shattered. So when we talk about their formation, we have to separate what is known from what is speculation. The safest explanation is simple. The 14 Flames were a gigantic volcanic region created by natural forces deep beneath the earth. But in the world of ice and fire, natural forces and magic are often impossible to completely separate. And that mystery becomes even more interesting when dragons enter the story. Long before the Valyrians became Dragonlords, they were largely a simple shepherd people. According to the histories, the Valyrians discovered dragons living around the 14 Flames. Nobody knows exactly where the dragons originally came from. Valyrian tradition says dragons originated in Valyria, but other traditions tell a different story. In the distant eastern lands, particularly around Asshai, there are stories claiming that dragons came from the Shadowlands and were brought to Valyria by mysterious people who knew ancient forms of magic. Even today, we do not know which story is true, but one thing is certain. The Valyrians learned how to control dragons, and once they discovered how to use dragons, their entire civilization changed. The 14 Flames became more than a group of volcanoes. They became the birthplace of Valyria's power. The dragons made the Valyrians almost unstoppable. Their enemies have thousands of soldiers, enormous armies, strong walls, and powerful kings. But none of that could easily stand against a dragon in the sky. The Valyrians eventually developed a society ruled by powerful families known as Dragonlords. These families controlled dragons and used them as weapons, symbols of power, and instruments of conquest. And this is where one important misconception about Valyria needs to be cleared up. The Targaryens were not the greatest Dragonlords of Valyria. In fact, they were nowhere near the top. House Targaryen was only one among many Valyrian Dragonlord families. There were dozens of powerful families competing for influence. The histories speak of roughly 40 rival Dragonlord families fighting for power inside the freehold. These families were wealthy, politically powerful, and connected to the dragons. The Targaryens were important, but they were not the ruling family of the entire freehold. They were simply one Valyrian house among many. And one of the most interesting families was House Bellarys. The Bellarys were an ancient Valyrian Dragonlord family and were among the most powerful families of the freehold. Unlike the Targaryens, however, they did not survive the Doom. Their name eventually disappeared from history, leaving the Targaryens as the only surviving Dragonlord house from Old Valyria. This is one of the reasons the Targaryens became so important after the Doom. They were not necessarily the strongest family before the catastrophe. They were simply one of the few who survived, and that survival completely changed the history of the world. There were also other Valyrian families with immense wealth and influence, although we should be careful about calling every Valyrian family a Dragonlord family. For example, the Velaryons were of Valyrian origin and later became extremely important in Westeros, but their family was not one of the great Dragonlord families of the Valyrian freehold in the same way as the Targaryens or Bellarys. The same distinction matters when discussing other Valyrian houses. Being Valyrian did not automatically mean being a Dragonlord. The Dragonlords were the elite. They were the families who possessed the greatest political power and, most importantly, control over dragons, and their power was not limited to warfare. The Valyrians became famous for magic. They developed extraordinary skills in metalworking and created Valyrian steel, a material that remained legendary even thousands of years later. They built enormous towers, roads, bridges, cities, and other structures that seemed almost impossible to ordinary people. But beneath this impressive civilization was a much darker reality. The Valyrian economy depended heavily on slavery. The 14 Flames contained enormous mines. The Valyrians sent slaves underground to search for valuable metals and minerals. The deeper the miners went, the hotter the environment became. The mines were filled with heat, poisonous air, steam, boiling water, molten rock, and deadly creatures. There were even stories of mysterious fireworms living beneath the earth. Slaves could disappear into the darkness and never return. But Valyria continued digging. The riches of the 14 Flames helped finance the freehold's expansion, while dragons provided the military power needed to conquer new lands. And this created a cycle. More conquest meant more slaves. More slaves meant more wealth. More wealth meant more power. And more power meant more conquest. Eventually, the Valyrian freehold became one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen. Its influence spread across huge parts of Essos. But west of Valyria was another ancient civilization, a civilization that would eventually become one of Valyria's greatest enemies, the people of the Rhoynar. The Rhoynar were not one single kingdom. They lived in powerful city-states along the enormous river Rhoynar. The Rhoynar was at the center of their civilization. The river was not simply a source of water. It was part of their identity. The Rhoynar worshipped the river as Mother Rhoynar, and their culture developed around it. They also possessed something that made them particularly interesting in the world of ice and fire: water magic. The Rhoynar were said to have water wizards who could manipulate the waters of the Rhoynar. This would become extremely important when they eventually went to war with the Dragonlords. At first, however, the Rhoynar and Valyrians were not enemies. For a long time, they traded with each other. Valyrian colonies appear along the western coast of Essos, including the great city of Volantis, which stood near the mouth of the Rhoynar. Trade brought the two civilizations together. But as the Valyrians became more powerful, their colonies began expanding, and the Rhoynar began to see them as a threat. Small disputes between Valyrian and Rhoynish cities gradually became larger conflicts. One of the earliest conflicts became known as the First Turtle War. The traditional story says the war began after Valyrians killed one of the enormous turtles that the Rhoynar considered sacred. The Rhoynar called these giant turtles the Old Men of the River. To the Rhoynar, these creatures were connected to Mother Rhoynar. The killing of one of these turtles was therefore more than simply an animal being killed. It was an insult. The conflict quickly became violent. Sar Mel was attacked and burned. But the Rhoynar had a weapon the Valyrians had not expected: their water wizards. According to the accounts, Rhoynish magic caused the river to flood Volandaris. A huge part of the city was supposedly washed away. Whether every detail of this story is literally true is impossible to know, but it shows something important. The Rhoynar were not helpless against Valyria. They had their own magic. They had their own powerful cities, and they were fiercely protective of their independence. The First Turtle War was only the beginning. More wars followed. There was the War of Three Princes, the Second Turtle War, the Fishermen's War, the Salt War, the Third Turtle War, the War on Dagger Lake, and eventually the Spice War. There were so many conflicts that historians could not easily count them all. For roughly 2.5 centuries, the Rhoynar and Valyrian colonies repeatedly fought each other. Cities were burned. Cities were rebuilt. People were killed. People were captured and enslaved. And slowly, the balance began moving toward Valyria. The biggest problem for the Rhoynar was that they fought as separate city-states. The princes of the Rhoynar were proud and independent. They did not want to surrender their freedom to another Rhoynish ruler. So when one city was attacked, the others did not always come to its aid. The Valyrians had the opposite advantage. Their colonies could support one another, and if a Valyrian colony faced a serious threat, it could call upon the power of the freehold itself. That meant the Rhoynar were often fighting several enemies at once. But the final conflict would be different. It became known as the Second Spice War. And this was a war that finally destroyed the old Rhoynish civilization. The conflict began when Volantis became increasingly aggressive toward the Rhoynar. Volantis was itself a Valyrian colony, but it had become extremely powerful. Its rulers wanted more land, more wealth, and more control over the trade routes of the Rhoyne. The target eventually became Sarhoy, one of the great Rhoynish cities. Sarhoy was attacked by the Volantines and Valyrian Dragonlords. The city was destroyed. Its people were slaughtered or enslaved. And after destroying Sarhoy, the conquerors reportedly spread salt over its ruins. The message was clear. Sarhoy would never rise again. The destruction shocked the remaining Rhoynish princes. For generations they had fought separate wars. But now they realized that the Valyrians were not going to stop. One city could be destroyed today. Another could be destroyed tomorrow. And, eventually, the entire Rhoynar civilization could disappear. At this moment, a powerful prince named Garin of Croyane stepped forward. Garin believed that the Rhoynar had only one chance. They had to unite. So he called upon the princes of the Rhoyne to join him. The response was enormous. An army was assembled at Croyane. According to the histories, Garin's army contained approximately 250,000 soldiers. That made it one of the largest armies ever assembled in Essos. Men from across the Rhoyne joined the campaign. Garin believed that the Rhoynar could defeat the Valyrians if they stayed close to the river. Why? Because the Rhoynar believed their water magic could protect them from dragon fire. And at first, Garin appeared to be correct. The Rhoynar army achieved several major victories. They defeated Valyrian forces at Selleries. They defeated them again at Valisar. And then came the battle at Volandaries. The Rhoynar defeated a huge Valyrian army. They reportedly killed 2 dragons. For the first time, the supposedly unstoppable Valyrian Dragonlords had suffered a major defeat, and this was a serious problem for Valyria. The Rhoynar had shown that dragons could be killed, but the Valyrians had one advantage that Garin could not match. They had more dragons, much more. When a defeat became known in Valyria, the Dragonlords decided that ordinary armies were no longer enough. They would use the full power of the Freehold. According to the accounts, around 300 dragons were sent against Garin's army. Imagine the scene. 250,000 soldiers standing beside the Great Rhoyne. Then the sky begins to darken, not because of clouds, because of dragons. Hundreds of them. The greatest weapon in the ancient world had been unleashed. The Rhoynar army could not survive. Dragon fire swept across the battlefield. Men, horses, weapons, and camps were destroyed. The army that had seemed capable of defeating Valyria was broken. Garin was captured. The Rhoynar had lost. And this defeat changed the future of Essos forever. The surviving Rhoynish cities were now exposed. Some were destroyed. Others were forced to submit. Thousands were killed. Many more were enslaved. The old Rhoynish civilization was collapsing. But one person understood that continuing the war would mean the complete destruction of her people. Her name was Nymeria. Princess Nymeria ruled New York Sar. She had warned Garin that the Rhoynar could not defeat the Valyrians. She had been right. Now there was only one choice left. Escape. Nymeria gathered the surviving Rhoynar. Men, women, children, families, warriors, and refugees. They left Essos. The legendary story says they used 10,000 ships. And this became one of the greatest migrations in the history of the world. The Rhoynar sailed away from the lands where their civilization had existed for centuries. They crossed the seas. They wandered for years. They searched for a place where the dragons of Valyria could not reach them. Eventually, they found it, Dorne. Dorne was far from the heart of Valyrian power. It was hot, harsh, mountainous, and difficult to conquer. And there, Nymeria and her people began a new life. Nymeria eventually married Mors Martell, one of the powerful Dornish lords. Their union helped create the dynasty that would eventually become House Nymeros Martell. The Rhoynar, therefore, did not completely disappear. Their civilization in Essos was destroyed, but their people survived. Their blood, customs, language, traditions, and stories became part of Dornish culture. And that is why the story of the Rhoynar matters so much. It was not simply another war between two ancient civilizations. It was one of the greatest clashes between dragon fire and water magic in the history of the world. On one side stood the Valyrian Freehold, an enormous civilization controlled by dragonlords and supported by hundreds of dragons. On the other stood the independent city-states of the Rhoynar, united only when they realized that their survival was at stake. The Rhoynar fought bravely. They even defeated dragons. But against hundreds of dragons, they eventually had no answer. And this brings us back to the 14 Flames. The same volcanic mountains that helped create Valyria's power would eventually become the center of its destruction. The Valyrians believed they had mastered fire. They controlled dragons. They mined the earth. They practiced magic. They conquered civilizations. They defeated the Giscari. They defeated the Rhoynar. They built a freehold that seemed almost impossible to destroy. But there was one enemy they could never truly conquer: the earth beneath their feet. The 14 Flames had given Valyria its dragons, its mines, its wealth, and much of its power. And centuries later, those same mountains would erupt. Not one volcano, not two. The entire region would be transformed. The civilization that had survived wars, conquered kingdoms, and ruled through dragons would disappear in a single catastrophic event. That event would become known as the Doom of Valyria. But before we reach the Doom, there is one final thing to remember. The Targaryens were not the greatest family of old Valyria. They were survivors. The great Dragonlord families that once competed for control of the freehold disappeared. The Bellarys vanished. Countless other Dragonlord families vanished. The cities disappeared. The dragons disappeared. The freehold disappeared. And from the ashes, one relatively minor Valyrian family would eventually rise to dominate Westeros. House Targaryen. That is the strange irony of Valyria. The family that inherited the future was not necessarily the family that ruled the past. The true rulers of the old world were gone. And the story of the Targaryens only became possible because almost everyone else was destroyed. The 14 Flames had created the world of Valyria. The Dragonlords had turned that world into an empire. The Rhoynar had fought desperately against that empire. And eventually, all of them would be swallowed by history. But the fires of Valyria were not completely extinguished. Even after the Doom, sailors would still see strange red glows around the ruined peninsula. The smoking sea would become one of the most feared places in the world. And somewhere beneath those broken mountains, the secrets of the old freehold would remain buried. Dragons, magic, Valyrian steel, ancient knowledge, and perhaps secrets that even the surviving Targaryens never understood. Because the greatest mystery of Valyria is not simply how powerful it became. It is how such a powerful civilization could disappear so completely. And to understand that, we must finally enter the day when the 14 Flames erupted, the day the greatest civilization of the ancient world died, the Doom of Valyria. And that brings us to the end of this episode. But the story of Valyria is far from over. In the next episode, we will finally enter the Doom of Valyria, the mysterious catastrophe that destroyed the greatest civilization in the known world. What really happened that day? Why did the 14 Flames erupt? And how did House Targaryen survive when almost every other Dragonlord family was wiped out? We'll explore all of it in the next episode. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to Westeros Wonders, and turn on the notification bell. Until then, we'll see you in the next episode.